Thanks very much. And I too want to thank the AFT and the Shanker Institute for creating this forum. I think these are hugely important issues, and so I'm excited to have the chance to talk with folks about it today. And want to largely echo Mira's sort of case making around why this is so important, and so don't want to try and reiterate that, but I really do think that this civic mission is foundational to why we have public education, and is something that actually needs to be reinvigorated. And I strongly believe the Common Core can be an important lever for reinvigorating that focus on the civic mission of schools. So that's what I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about. And I'm going to do that in two ways. One is just to talk a little bit about how I think the civic mission of schools is really built into the Common Core in its content, in its design. And then I want to just talk about some practical recommendations that I think we really need to attend to if the Common Core is going to advance this mission. So in terms of the focus being built into the Common Core, I think it's important just to start with the fact that the Common Core in English language arts and in the literacy standards explicitly articulates very little content. It is really largely a description of the kinds of skills and abilities that we want students to demonstrate. Some of those are very important to civic participation. They are relevant to college and career readiness, but they are just as important to civic participation, like the speaking and listening standards, that ability to engage in dialogue and debate with others. When it talks about weighing the relevance and the credibility of evidence, obviously very important to being an active citizen and deciding which candidates you want to support, which ballot initiatives, and being a good juror. In the mathematics as well, I think its focus on quantitative literacy is very important to civic participation. I mean, we look right now, Washington is sort of stuck in these debates that largely revolve around math that I think is not actually terribly well understood by lots of people who need to decide who they want to support. So in those knowledge and skills writ large, there is civic relevance, but I think it's the thing I want to point out is the only content that the Common Core prescribes is actually foundational documents of American democracy. So in the English language arts standards in high school, there's only 3 documents that the Common Core says every American ought to have read by the time they graduate from high school. And those are the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and Lincoln's second inaugural address. That's it. And I think there's a pretty clear signal there. And even beyond naming those documents, it talks about, delineating, this is straight from the standards, delineating and evaluating the reasoning in seminal U.S. texts, including the application of constitutional principles and use of legal reasoning, for example, in U.S. Supreme Court majority opinions and dissents. Now, I think that's a great ambition. I wonder, and I think Nape would suggest we have many, many Americans who are graduating from high school right now who could not read and analyze the application of constitutional principles in Supreme Court decisions. It also talks about analyzing 17th, 18th, and 19th century foundational U.S. documents of historical and literary significance. Again, there's a number of these. Many of even the examples where it's pointing to what you could choose to focus on, many of those are of civic relevance and importance. So they talk about Washington's farewell address, the Federalist Papers. So the first point I want to make is actually the drafting of the Common Core had this purpose very much in mind. And so then the other 2 points I want to make, one is a set of practical recommendations, but before that is just to recognize that this aspect of the Common Core, it's not self-executing. If we don't decide that this is going to be a priority in Common Core implementation, it won't happen. And so one of the ways that I think we can advance this mission through the Common Core is to start talking about this aspect of the Common Core as central to its purpose, central to its success. And I actually think that there are folks out there who are curious not just about the empirical basis for the college and career ready focus, but actually they just have questions about, is that really everything we want for our kids? And I think we're missing out on the opportunity to bring more folks along by not explaining that this is a core purpose. And I would say, even to the, I think when I think across some of our political polarization right now, if we talk about really making sure that students are more, can scrutinize their government more, have their own personal understanding of the U.S. Constitution, I actually think that's something that would resonate across political lines. So with all that, let me articulate 4 or 5 what I think of as pretty practical things that we need to do to advance this mission. So one is selecting curriculum that includes topics of civic relevance. And that means not just in a civics class, but actually in science, making the problem solving that students are doing, put it in a real world context of how we need to use science to solve problems of public policy, to address issues. Sort of out there in the world. I think that cuts across science, English language arts, and I've talked about mathematics being something that we need to work on a lot just in our public policy. The second thing is training teachers to facilitate discussions of policy issues and really to facilitate discussions of contentious topics. I think actually this is something they haven't necessarily had a lot of exposure to in their own education, so it hasn't necessarily been modeled. Maybe for some of them it has been modeled around their dinner table, but for many it hasn't. And so actually recognizing that, one, the incentives have not been there. That's not what's been expected of teachers. So if we want this to happen moving forward in the kinds of experiences our kids have in school, then we got to think about what kind of training the teachers need, what kind of practice and feedback do they need, and where are the incentives that says this is expected, because if it's not, I worry very much that it won't happen. Third is to ensure that assessments themselves cover issues of civic relevance. So one is, at a very practical level, the high school summative assessments under the Common Core regime ought to have a prompt that includes one of those required texts. There's only 3 of them. I don't think that means you would necessarily, that doesn't mean you will just get to rote learning of kids trying to memorize these documents. When you read the standards about analyzing and delineating the reasoning and making arguments and applying constitutional principles, that's what we should be asking them to do. And part of that, they should recognize one of the questions they're going to see at the end of high school, and actually it's in both 9th, 10th, and 11th, 12th grade standards. So questions they're going to see in high school, ask them to apply what they know about American democracy. The second way, though, is just having questions, again, across lots of different topics that engage students in problem solving, in applying what they know in a civically relevant context. The fourth thing, excuse me, is to really try to get much more clear about determining what quality looks like in these outcomes. So asking, what does it look like when a school is doing a good job of this? What does it look like when a teacher is doing a good job of this? We're very focused right now on teaching frameworks and this conversation about improving practice. This needs to be in that conversation about what does it mean to create a classroom, a student experience that is advancing this civic mission. I think Mira spoke some about how students are going to learn what's expected of them as citizens in school one way or another. So how do we put that in the conversation that principals and teachers are having about improving instruction? And finally, thinking consistent with that about the value proposition for students as well. How will they know if they're getting good at this? And I do wonder, this seems like a space that's ripe for potentially badges, ways for students to sort of show that they are civically engaged. And I even wonder about sort of a diploma with distinction in civics or in civic engagement. And the last thing I'll say is just to recognize that I really believe the Common Core presents a tremendous opportunity, but we're very much still at the front end of trying to figure out what it's going to take to make this work. And I think one of the things we've recognized in the work we're doing with urban districts and state leaders is that there's a tremendous need for foundational content knowledge building. And I'll point actually to the close reading, the close reading. So we put out a primer a little over a year ago about close reading and how it fits as one strategy in a curriculum, in an approach to teaching students how to read, because we became very worried that there was all this political noise about all the examples are close reading and the expectation is that's all teachers are going to do. teachers actually, not only were they not just doing that, they were actually wondering what people were talking about, like what is close reading. It's all of a sudden it came out in the political conversations, but it's not as though that was a term that was widely used in the field, and everybody just knew what that was and how it fit in and when they were going to use it. So I think we have to recognize that's a huge opportunity. There's lots of content knowledge building that teachers and principals and everybody working in the education system needs. So figuring out how we seize that opportunity to advance this mission just seems like a great opportunity. Thanks.